Now we also see the wings, the greater and lesser wings. So the greater wing is this really large portion of the bone sticking out, whereas the lesser wing are these smaller ones right here. Now looking at an anterior view, again we see the wings, so greater wing sticking out, all of this, lesser wing, smaller one sitting above it. We also see the foramen rotundum here as it's coming through to the anterior side. And then we see the pterygoid process. So if we look at these processes, there's one on each side. This is the lateral plate. And then we have the medial plate on the inside. It's also called the medial and lateral lamina. But this one would be the medial. And so put together, both of these are called the pterygoid processes. We can see again the medial plate right there, and then the lateral plate right here. Now, more structures we have on the sphenoid bone is something called the superior orbital fissure. Now, orbital is telling you it's a part of the orbit. Superior meaning it's above, because later on we'll see also an inferior orbital fissure. But a fissure is just an elongated cleft, meaning it almost looks like a cut of space, and this is found between those two wings. We also have the anterior clinoid process, and there is one on each side. These are just points found on the lesser wing that are facing towards the sella turcica. The optic groove is just a narrow little groove that runs between the two optic foramen. And then in the sphenoid bone, we can also find a sinus, just called the sphenoidal sinus. So looking at the same anterior view, we can see these holes right here showing you there's a space in here that's filled with air, and that's the sphenoidal sinus. And then we can also see the superior orbital fissure. And if you look closely, it is just this cutout right here. And if we looked a little bit higher, we see very narrowly there's some space going right between those two wings there, and that's what the superior orbital fissure is. Now, filling in our last structures here, we have the optic groove right here. You see there's a little groove just running between the left and the right optic foramen. And then we also have these anterior clinoid processes, which are just these smaller little points right here that are facing the sella turcica, and there'll be one on each side. So anterior clinoid process. Moving on to the maxillary bone, we also have a frontal process of the maxillary bone. And so this will be going up towards the frontal bone or forehead. This will be forming support to the nose, so just on the lateral aspect of the nose. On the maxillary bone, we'll also have a zygomatic process that's going to stick out to the zygomatic bone. Now, in the maxillary bone is where we'll find the infraorbital foramen. So if you remember, we had a supraorbital foramen of the frontal bone. Well, the one that's below the eye orbit is going to be found on the maxillary bone. And then we have the alveolar processes, which are almost like gums, but they're just going to form the foundation that teeth are going to sit in. We also have a palatine process. So this is what forms the hard palate or the roof of the mouth. These actually come from the maxillary bones. The incisive foramen is just named after the incisors, which are a type of teeth where this hole is found next to. But this is at the front of the roof of the mouth. In the maxillary bone, there's also a sinus called the maxillary sinus. And sometimes when you're not feeling so well, your cheeks get a little pressure or they feel a little puffy, and that's due to this sinus being filled with mucus. And then the maxillary bone is also going to contain the inferior orbital fissure. So as we take a look here, the infraorbital foramen is pretty apparent, just the hole below the eye orbit. Now on the inside of each maxillary bone is also going to be the maxillary sinus. And we can also see the frontal process, which is just this bump right here as it sticks up to the frontal bone.